Hey there, welcome back. Today we're serving up some trending tidbits. Those fascinating little nuggets of information that are making waves. We'll be exploring two seemingly unconnected trends that have some unexpected links. The quest for spiritual enlightenment and cutting-edge brain science. We've got a really in-depth meta-analysis on spinal motoneuron electrophysiology, which basically means how our nerves tell our muscles to move, and a study on why people travel to the Hindu sacred city Kashi to die. Buckle up, because this is going to get interesting.
I'm ready when you are.
Okay, so let's start with this whole science of movement thing. This meta-analysis on motor neurons found that even basic movements are surprisingly complex. I mean, have you ever really thought about what it takes to just take a step?
Right. It's easy to overlook just how intricate the process is. This study examined 11 different electrical properties of motoneurons, which are the nerve cells that directly control muscle contraction. Some of these properties, like the resting membrane potential, and the size of the electrical signal that travels down the neuron. We call that the action potential, were very consistent across different studies. But other properties were much more variable.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying even though these motor neurons are doing the same basic job, they're not all wired the same way?
Exactly. One property that showed a lot of variation is something called rheobase. Think of it like this. Imagine you have a light switch. Rheobase is basically the minimum amount of pressure you need to apply to flip the switch and turn on the light. In the case of neurons, it's the minimum amount of electrical current needed to activate the neuron and make the muscle contract.
Okay, so some motor neurons are like those super sensitive light switches,
Mhm.
where just a feather touch will turn them on, while others are like those old sticky ones that you have to really jam your finger into.
That's a great analogy. And the study found that this rheobase varied a lot depending on factors like the species, age and sex of the animal, and even the specific type of movement being performed. Now, why this matters is that understanding what impacts how these motor neurons behave is critical for things like treating spinal cord injuries
Oh.
or developing new prosthetics.
So if scientists can figure out how to fine-tune the rheobase of these motor neurons, could that potentially lead to new therapies for people with movement disorders?
Potentially, yes. And here's what's really fascinating. Even after accounting for all these biological factors, there's still a lot of unexplained variation in the data. This means there are other hidden factors influencing how our nerves control our muscles, things we haven't even begun to understand.
Wow. That's both amazing and a little unsettling, right? I mean, it's incredible that we still have so much to learn about the human body, even at such a fundamental level.
Absolutely. It highlights the immense complexity of the nervous system and the vast territory that still remains to be explored.
Okay, so now let's switch gears completely and talk about this other trend, the one about people traveling to Kashi to die. This study was trying to understand what motivates people to make such a profound journey. And honestly, it really makes you think about the different ways people approach life and death.
It certainly does. In Hinduism, Kashi is considered incredibly sacred, and dying there is believed to offer moksha, liberation from the cycle of rebirth.
That's right. And for those unfamiliar with Hindu beliefs, this idea of escaping the cycle of death and rebirth is incredibly important.
Exactly. It's about transcending the limitations of the physical world and achieving a state of spiritual enlightenment.
And the study found that for people traveling to Kashi, the main motivators were a deep spiritual inclination and a desire to detach from worldly pleasures. In fact, one participant said, and this really stuck with me, nothing is there in this world. It's full of pain and struggles. People are not good. One should not attach to anything but God.
That's a powerful statement, and it really speaks to the core of what these individuals are seeking: liberation from suffering and a connection to something greater than themselves.
You know, it's interesting to think about how different this perspective is. From the scientific lens we were just looking at with the motoneuron research, one is focused on understanding the intricate mechanisms of our physical bodies, while the other is about transcending the physical altogether.
You've hit on a key point there. They seem like completely opposite approaches. But what's fascinating is that they both ultimately lead us to the same fundamental question: what is the self?
Hold on, I'm intrigued. How so?
Well, the motoneuron research is essentially exploring the physical foundations of the self, how our bodies move and interact with the world. On the other hand, those seeking moksha in Kashi are striving to liberate themselves from the confines of the physical self to achieve a state of pure consciousness.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
But how does this concept of self connect to the bigger picture? Where do these two seemingly disparate trends intersect?
That's where things get really interesting. To understand this intersection, we need to take a look at some research that bridges the gap between neuroscience and spirituality. A paper published in Frontiers in Communication explores how both Buddhism and neuroscience are challenging the very idea of a unified self.
Wait, so you're telling me that both modern science and ancient spiritual traditions are suggesting that our sense of me might be more complicated than we think? I'm all ears, tell me more.
Exactly. Both fields are pointing to the idea that our sense of self might not be this solid, unchanging entity that we often perceive it to be.
Okay, that's a pretty mind-blowing concept. How do they even begin to approach this idea?
Well, neuroscience is revealing that the brain processes information in parallel, meaning different parts of the brain are doing different things simultaneously. It's kind of like a massive orchestra with different sections playing different parts, yet somehow it all comes together to create a harmonious symphony.
So our brains are like a giant jam session, and our sense of self is the final song that emerges.
That's a great way to put it. And what's fascinating is that Buddhism has been saying something similar for centuries. They teach that our experience of self is actually composed of 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness that are constantly interacting and changing.
Wait a minute, back up a
That's
second. What exactly are these 5 aggregates?
Great question. Form refers to the physical body. Feeling encompasses our sensory experiences: pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Perception is how we interpret and make sense of those sensations. Mental formations are our thoughts, emotions, and impulses. And consciousness is the awareness that ties it all together.
Okay, so it's like our sense of self is a composite, built from all these different elements that are constantly in flux.
Precisely. And both Buddhism and neuroscience seem to agree that this sense of a unified permanent self is more of an illusion than a reality.
Whoa, okay. So if our sense of self is more fluid than we think, what does that mean for our actions? Do we really have free will?
That's where things get even more interesting. The Frontiers in Communication paper that I mentioned earlier specifically argues that both neuroscience and Buddhism challenge the traditional notion of free will.
Now that's a topic that could lead us down a serious rabbit hole.
It certainly can. But what's important to remember is that both disciplines suggest that our actions are influenced by a complex web of factors, many of which we're not even aware of. Neuroscience is showing that our brains are making decisions on a subconscious level all the time. And Buddhism teaches that our actions are shaped by karma, the law of cause and effect.
So on one hand, we've got the intricate workings of our brains influencing our choices. And on the other hand, we have this concept of karmic consequences from past actions shaping our present. It's like we're caught in this intricate dance between biology and cosmic forces.
Exactly. And it's important to clarify that in Buddhism, karma isn't about punishment or reward. It's about understanding that our actions create ripples that extend outward, impacting both ourselves and the world around us.
Okay, so karma is more about understanding the interconnectedness of everything, rather than some cosmic scorecard.
You got it. And this idea of interconnectedness is crucial for understanding how both neuroscience and Buddhism offer pathways to greater freedom.
Hold on a second. How can challenging the idea of free will actually lead to greater freedom? That sounds kind of paradoxical.
It might seem counterintuitive, but think of it this way. The more we understand about the factors that influence our thoughts and behaviors, whether those factors are rooted in our biology or in past actions, the better equipped we are to make conscious, intentional choices.
So it's not about denying the influence of these factors, but rather becoming more aware of them so we can navigate them more skillfully.
Precisely. From a neuroscientific perspective, this means gaining awareness of those automatic subconscious patterns that drive our behavior. Buddhism offers tools like mindfulness meditation to cultivate this awareness.
So in both cases, it's about recognizing those habitual patterns and developing the ability to choose differently.
Yes. And that ability to choose, even if it's not entirely free from external influences, can be incredibly empowering.
This is blowing my mind. I'm starting to see how these two seemingly disparate trends, the science of movement and the quest for moksha, are not only connected, but actually complement each other.
They do. And there's one more crucial aspect of this connection that we need to explore: compassion.
Compassion. How does that fit into all of this?
Well, if we accept the idea that the self is not a fixed, isolated entity, but rather interconnected and fluid, as both neuroscience and Buddhism suggest, then compassion becomes a natural extension of that understanding.
Okay, I see what you mean. If we recognize that we're all part of this larger web of existence, then caring for the well-being of others just makes sense. It's like recognizing the inherent interconnectedness of all things shifts our perspective from me versus them to we're all in this together.
Exactly. And this isn't just some abstract philosophical concept. Modern neuroscience is starting to uncover the biological basis for compassion. We're finding that specific brain circuits are activated when we experience empathy and engage in altruistic behavior.
So compassion isn't just some fluffy, feel-good emotion. It's actually wired into our brains. That's pretty amazing.
It really is. It suggests that compassion might be an essential part of what makes us human, a fundamental aspect of our neurobiology.
I love that idea, that compassion is woven into the very fabric of our being. It's not something we have to force or fake, but rather something we can tap into and cultivate.
Absolutely. And both the scientific understanding of the brain and the spiritual practices offered by traditions like Buddhism can help us develop this capacity for compassion.
This whole conversation has been such a wild ride. We started by talking about how our nerves tell our muscles to move. Then we explored the motivations of people seeking spiritual liberation in Kashi. And now we're talking about the neuroscience of compassion. Who would have thought those trending tidbits would be so interconnected?
It's been quite the journey, and it highlights that even seemingly unrelated trends can converge on profound insights about the human experience.
I totally agree. So before we wrap up, I have one final question for you and for all of our listeners out there. We've talked about how both neuroscience and Buddhism offer paths toward greater freedom and self-understanding. But what if those paths aren't actually separate? What if a deeper understanding of the brain, such as that being uncovered by neuroscientists, could actually enhance and complement the spiritual pursuit of self-realization, like what those seeking moksha in Kashi are striving for?
That's a really thought-provoking question. It challenges us to consider that science and spirituality might not be in conflict, but rather two sides of the same coin, each offering a unique lens through which to understand the mysteries of the human experience.
Exactly. And it leaves us with so much to ponder. Is it possible that these two seemingly different paths are ultimately leading us toward the same destination, a deeper understanding of ourselves and our place in the universe?
It's a beautiful and profound question, and one that I encourage everyone to explore further.
Well, on that note, a huge thank you to you for joining me on this deep dive into these trending tidbits, and to all of our listeners for tuning in. We hope this conversation has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of life.